It was just after 9 p.m. when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court pulled out of the underground parking garage beneath the court building. The day had been long, a series of complex hearings followed by hours of writing opinions in his chambers. Streetlights flickered on as he drove through the quiet Washington streets, his mind still occupied with the constitutional questions that had dominated the day's arguments. The Chief Justice was a man who had spent decades interpreting the nation's laws. At 63, with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried himself with the measured dignity his position demanded. Yet tonight, in his plain blue sedan, he was simply a tired man heading home to his wife and the dinner she'd promised to keep warm. He turned onto a tree-lined avenue, the grand historic homes of Georgetown coming into view. The spring evening was pleasant enough that he'd rolled down his window slightly, letting in the scent of newly bloomed cherry blossoms that made Washington famous this time of year. The flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror came as a surprise. The Chief Justice checked his speedometer, he'd been going exactly the speed limit, and signaled to pull over, guiding his car smoothly to the curb. As a man who had always respected law enforcement, his first thought was simple concern. Perhaps a taillight was out, or he'd failed to notice some minor traffic violation. He reached for his wallet, retrieving his driver's license as he waited for the officer to approach. This was routine, he thought. Nothing to worry about. The heavy footsteps approaching his car were quicker than expected, more urgent. The beam of a flashlight swept across his face with unnecessary brightness, causing him to squint and raise a hand to shield his eyes. Hands. Where I can see them. The voice from beyond the light was sharp, tense, lacking the professional calm the Chief Justice had expected. "Of course, officer," he replied, slowly placing both hands on the steering wheel, his wallet and license still in his right hand. "I have my identification right here. I said hands on the wheel, both of them." The officer's voice rose, edged with something that made the Chief Justice's heartbeat quicken. Something was wrong. "My apologies," he said, setting his wallet on the dashboard with deliberate slowness. "It's just my license." Step out of the vehicle. Now. The Chief Justice blinked in confusion. "Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?" What happened next occurred with a speed that left witnesses on nearby porches gasping. The officer yanked open the car door, grabbed the Chief Justice by his suit jacket, and roughly pulled him from the vehicle. "You people always think you're above the rules," the officer muttered, just loud enough for the Chief Justice to hear. The words carried a venom that shocked the older man nearly as much as the physical treatment. "Officer, there seems to be a misunderstanding," the Chief Justice began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Shut up," the officer snapped, spinning him around and pushing him against the car. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Expensive car, driving through this neighborhood where you don't belong." The Chief Justice felt his chest tighten. The expensive car was a 6-year-old sedan. The neighborhood where he didn't belong was 3 blocks from the home where he'd lived for 15 years. "Officer, my name is—" he began again, trying to explain, to bring reason to a situation rapidly spiraling out of control. The click of a gun being drawn silenced him. Around them, the evening seemed to freeze. A woman walking her dog across. The street stopped mid-stride. A young couple on their porch stood up in alarm. A passing car slowed, then pulled over. "I said shut up," the officer hissed, and now the gun was pointed directly at the Chief Justice's head. "I'm tired of you people thinking you run everything. One more word and I'll—" The officer's next words were drowned out by the sound of doors opening. 2 people from the house directly opposite had emerged onto their front lawn. One held up a phone, clearly recording. "Hey," a voice called out. "What's going on over there? Why is your gun drawn?" The officer's attention flickered toward the voice, and in that moment, the Chief Justice spoke with the calm authority that had defined his career on the bench. "Officer, I am the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. My ID is on the dashboard. I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding." Something in his tone, the unmistakable ring of truth, made the officer hesitate. But the gun remained pointed at the Chief Justice's head. "Yeah, right," the officer scoffed. but there was now uncertainty in his voice. "And I'm the president." "Check my identification," the Chief Justice insisted. "Please." A second police car pulled up, its lights flashing but sirens silent. An older officer stepped out, a sergeant based on the stripes on his uniform. "What's the situation here, Thompson?" the sergeant called out. The first officer, Thompson, didn't lower his weapon. "Got a suspect, fits the description from the robbery call." The sergeant approached cautiously, taking in the scene. The well-dressed older man with his hands up, the growing number of bystanders with phones recording, the expensive homes surrounding them. "Sir, can you identify yourself?" The sergeant asked, addressing the Chief Justice directly. "My wallet is on the dashboard. You'll find my driver's license and Supreme Court identification there." The sergeant glanced at Thompson, whose face had gone pale. "Lower your weapon, officer," he ordered quietly. "But Sarge, now Thompson." Reluctantly, Thompson lowered his gun, though he didn't holster it. The sergeant reached into the car and retrieved the wallet, opening it to reveal the identification cards inside. His expression changed immediately. "Officer Thompson, holster your weapon immediately," the sergeant ordered, his voice now sharp with alarm. Then, turning to the Chief Justice, his tone transformed completely. "Sir, I cannot begin to apologize for this misunderstanding. Are you hurt?" "I am physically unharmed," the Chief Justice replied with remarkable composure. He straightened his jacket, dignity intact, despite the ordeal. "Though I believe we have a serious situation to address." By now, at least a dozen onlookers had gathered. Phones recorded everything. Someone had recognized the Chief Justice and was explaining to others who he was. Whispers spread through the small crowd. "Sir, if you would prefer to discuss this somewhere more private," the sergeant began. "I think transparency is essential at this moment," the Chief Justice replied. "Officer Thompson made several concerning statements that suggest this was not merely a case of mistaken identity. He referred to me as you people and suggested I didn't belong in this neighborhood." Thompson's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "He was acting suspicious," he muttered. "I was driving home from work," the Chief Justice corrected. "Sergeant, I would like your badge number and Officer Thompson's. I will be filing a formal complaint, not out of vindictiveness, but because what happened here tonight represents precisely the kind of policing that undermines public trust in law enforcement." The sergeant nodded grimly. "Of course, sir, and I'll be initiating an internal investigation immediately." A woman stepped forward from the gathering crowd. "I got it all on video," she said. "He had his gun pointed at your head for no reason." Others murmured agreement. Someone mentioned calling the news. Another suggested calling the Attorney General directly. The Chief Justice raised his hand, and the crowd quieted, a testament to his natural authority. "What matters now is proper procedure. I appreciate everyone's concern, but let's ensure this is handled through the appropriate channels." Thompson stood rigidly by his patrol car, his expression a mixture of defiance and dawning horror as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. The Chief Justice turned to him directly. "Officer, I don't know what led you to approach me as you did tonight, but I want you to understand something. The law protects everyone equally, including you. You will have the opportunity to explain your actions through due process, the same due process that you nearly denied me tonight." The words hung in the air, simple but powerful. Several onlookers nodded in agreement. The sergeant was already on his radio, his voice low but urgent. Within minutes, more police cars arrived, along with an unmarked vehicle that brought a police captain to the scene. News vans weren't far behind, their satellite dishes visible from blocks away as they rushed toward what would soon become a national story. Through it all, the Chief Justice remained remarkably composed. He gave a brief statement to the captain, provided his contact information, and politely declined immediate medical attention. When asked if he wanted to press charges, he simply said, "I want the law to take its proper course." As he was finally escorted to his car, now with a police captain apologizing profusely and offering a security detail to follow him home, the Chief Justice paused. He looked back at Officer Thompson, who was now sitting in the back of a police cruiser, being questioned by internal affairs officers who had arrived with remarkable speed. In that moment, their eyes met. The officer looked away first. The Chief Justice finally slid back into his car, closed the door, and took a deep breath, his first real moment of privacy since the ordeal began. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. Not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened and what would surely follow. Everything seemed surreal, like frames from a movie playing out of sequence. Richard stood tall despite the handcuffs, his eyes fixed on the sergeant. He understood the power of images, how quickly they could spread, what stories they could tell. Right now, the story being captured was one of indignity and injustice. But what happened next would determine how that story ended. "Governor Chen," Miller said, taking a step forward, his voice now heavy with respect and undisguised fear. "Sir, there's been a terrible misunderstanding." Daniel's head snapped toward his superior, then back to Richard, his expression morphing from smug confidence to dawning horror. Officer Taylor took an unconscious step backward, as if trying to remove himself from the scene entirely. "A misunderstanding," Richard repeated, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Is that what we're calling it?" A bead of sweat trickled down Miller's temple despite the cool evening air. "Sir, if you'll allow me to remove those handcuffs immediately." "What was the reason for the stop, Sergeant Miller?" Richard asked, making no move to turn around for the handcuffs to be removed. "Your officer said I was driving erratically. Is there dash cam footage to support that claim?" Miller swallowed hard. "Sir, please, let's get those restraints off you. First." "Answer my question, Sergeant," Richard insisted, aware of the growing audience. Some people had stepped out of their vehicles now, phones raised, faces curious and concerned. This moment mattered, not just for him but for everyone who had ever been wrongfully stopped, everyone who had ever had their dignity stripped away on the side of a road. Miller's gaze flickered nervously to the gathering crowd before returning to Richard. "There's no dash cam footage, sir. Our department hasn't received the funding for cameras yet." "I see," Richard said. "And the body cameras your officers are wearing?" Miller's silence was answer enough. There were no body cameras either. "So it's just their word against mine," Richard continued. "Except I'm the one in handcuffs and I'm the one who was called." He paused, looking directly at Daniels. "What was it you called me? Foreigner? Despite my telling you I was born in Portland?" Daniel stared at his shoes. His earlier bravado evaporated. A car door slammed nearby, and a man in a rumpled suit hurried toward them, press badge swinging from his neck. Richard recognized him, Tom Welker from the local newspaper. Of course, this was happening in front of a reporter. The universe had a twisted sense of humor sometimes. "Governor Chen?" Welker called out, disbelief coloring his voice as he took in the scene. "What's happening here?" Before Richard could respond, Miller stepped forward, positioning himself between the governor and the reporter. "Sir, please let me remove these handcuffs immediately. This situation has gotten completely out of hand." Richard nodded finally, turning to allow the sergeant access to the restraints. As Miller fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking slightly, Richard addressed the reporter. "Mr. Welker, isn't it? From the Daily Chronicle. I was returning from an unscheduled community meeting in Pine Ridge when I was pulled over. I'm still waiting to learn the official reason why." The metal bracelets fell away, and Richard rubbed his wrists, the skin red and irritated. The physical relief was immediate, but the humiliation lingered, a bitter taste at the back of his throat. Welker's pen was already flying across his notepad. "Were you alone, Governor? Where was your security detail?" "I dismissed them for the evening," Richard admitted. "I wanted the meeting to be informal, just citizens talking to another citizen who happens to hold office." More people were gathering now, drawn by the flashing lights and the growing commotion. Richard recognized a few faces from the community meeting earlier. They stared in confusion and concern at their governor standing by a police car, surrounded by officers who looked like they wanted the ground to open up and swallow them whole. "Sir?" Miller said quietly. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation at the station? Or I could escort you." "No, Sergeant." Richard cut him off firmly. We'll finish this right here where it started. He turned to face the officers directly. I want to understand exactly what happened tonight. Daniels and Taylor exchanged nervous glances. Neither seemed eager to speak. Officer Daniels, Richard prompted. You pulled me over and immediately demanded my license and registration without explaining why. When I identified myself as the governor, you mocked me. When I offered to prove my identity, you ordered me out of the car. When I complied, you handcuffed me. Why? Daniels cleared his throat, his eyes darting everywhere except Richard's face. You were driving suspiciously, sir. Suspiciously, Richard repeated. Could you define that for me? Miller stepped in. Governor, I want to assure you that this does not reflect the values or training of our department. These officers will face— With all due respect, Sergeant, Richard interrupted. I asked Officer Daniels a question, and I'd like him to answer it. The crowd had grown quieter, straining to hear the exchange. The reporter's pen had stopped, moving as he waited for the response. Daniels shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Your car isn't what we usually see in this area, and it was late and you were taking back roads. So my vehicle and my choice of route made me suspicious, Richard clarified. Anything else? The silence stretched uncomfortably until Taylor spoke up, his voice barely audible. Your license plate is from the capital city. Richard nodded slowly, understanding dawning. I see. So a nice car with capital city plates, driven by someone who looks like me, on a back road at night. That's what constitutes suspicious in this county. Neither officer answered, but their silence said everything. The young woman who had been recording stepped forward. I got it all on video, Governor. Everything they said to you, how they treated you. It's all here. She held up her phone like evidence. A murmur went through the crowd. Someone in the back called out, "Shame on you," directed at the officers. Richard raised a hand, calming the growing anger. What's your name? He asked the young woman. Lily Thompson, sir, she replied. I live just up the road. Ms. Thompson, I appreciate your civic engagement, Richard said, but I don't want this to become a spectacle or an opportunity for division. What happened here tonight isn't unique or surprising to many people. The only unusual part is that it happened to someone with a title. He looked around at the gathered faces illuminated by headlights and the glow of phone screens. This wasn't how he had planned to connect with this community, but sometimes leadership meant seizing unplanned moments. I'd like everyone to listen, he continued, his voice carrying in the night air. What we do next matters more than what just happened. It would be easy to demand these officers' badges. It would be easy to file complaints and lawsuits. It would be easy to let anger and humiliation guide my response. Richard met Sergeant Miller's anxious gaze. But the harder path, the better path, is to use this moment to create something meaningful. Real change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from understanding and education. Miller looked like a man who had been granted an unexpected reprieve, though wariness remained in his eyes. What are you suggesting, Governor? Before Richard could answer, a large SUV with government plates screeched to a halt nearby. His security detail had finally tracked him down, alerted perhaps by concerned citizens or the growing chatter on social media. His chief of security, David Lee, rushed toward him, face tight with worry. Governor, are you all right? We got calls about— David stopped, taking in the scene with trained eyes. What happened here? I'm fine, David, Richard assured him. Just a misunderstanding that got out of hand. David didn't look convinced, especially when he noticed Richard massaging his wrists. Those are restraint marks, he said, voice hardening as he turned toward the local officers. David, Richard said firmly, I'm handling this. His security chief reluctantly backed down, though he positioned himself protectively at Richard's side, glaring at Daniels and Taylor. Richard addressed the sergeant again. I'll be coming to your station tomorrow morning, Sergeant Miller. Not to file a complaint, but to start a conversation. I want to meet with your entire department. This isn't over, it's just beginning. Miller nodded, relief and apprehension battling on his face. Yes, sir. Whatever you think is appropriate." The crowd had grown larger still, the story spreading through the small town like wildfire. Richard knew that by morning it would reach the capital, and by noon, national news. Images of their governor in handcuffs would flood social media, accompanied by outrage and calls for justice. But as he looked at the faces around him, the embarrassed officers, the concerned citizens, the eager reporter, Richard saw beyond the immediate scandal to the possibility it created. Sometimes it took a moment of stark clarity, of personal indignity to illuminate a path forward. He turned to David. "Let's go. We have work to do." As they walked toward the security vehicle, the crowd parted respectfully. Richard stopped beside Officer Daniels, who stiffened as if expecting a final condemnation. Instead, Richard simply said, "I'll see you tomorrow, officer. Be ready to talk, and more importantly, be ready to listen." Sleep didn't come easily to Richard that night. He lay awake in his hotel room, the events of the evening playing on repeat in his mind. The sting of the handcuffs, the mocking tone of the officers, the faces of the people watching from the roadside. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back there, feeling small despite his office, feeling foreign in the state he governed. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since he'd checked into the hotel. His press secretary had called 5 times. Each message more frantic than the last as video clips from the incident began circulating online. His chief of staff wanted an emergency meeting. The attorney general had texted, offering to personally prosecute the officers. Richard had responded to none of them. Tomorrow would be soon enough to deal with the political fallout. Tonight he needed to process what had happened not as a governor, but as a person. Dawn broke with a pale orange glow that spilled through the thin hotel curtains. Richard had managed maybe 3 hours of broken sleep, but adrenaline kept him alert as he showered and dressed. He chose a simple suit, nothing flashy or intimidating. Today wasn't about power. It was about connection. When he entered the hotel lobby, David was waiting along with 2 additional security officers. Their presence was non-negotiable after last night. "Morning, sir," David said, eyeing him with concern. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Richard replied automatically, then caught himself. "Actually, that's not true. I'm angry and hurt and embarrassed. But I'm also clear-headed about what needs to happen next." David nodded, his expression softening. "The car's ready, whenever you are. And, sir, the whole team is behind you on this." The police station was a modest brick building at the edge of town, American flag hanging limply in the still morning air. As their vehicle pulled into the parking lot, Richard noticed a small group of reporters already gathered near the entrance. Word had spread faster than he'd anticipated. "Want to use the back entrance?" David asked, noting the press. Richard shook his head. "No, nothing to hide here." As he stepped out of the car, camera flashes erupted like lightning. Questions were shouted, microphones thrust forward. Richard raised a hand, and surprisingly, the clamor quieted. "I'll be making a statement later today," he said. "Right now, I'm here to speak with the department. That's all." He walked toward the entrance, reporters parting before him. At the door, Sergeant Miller waited, looking like he hadn't slept any better than Richard had. His uniform was pressed to perfection, but his eyes were bloodshot, his face haggard. "Governor Chen," Miller said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Richard accepted the handshake, noting the firmness of the grip, neither overly apologetic nor defensively strong. "Just professional." "Let's get started, Sergeant," he said. The station's meeting room was packed. Every officer not on active patrol sat in rigid attention, uniforms crisp, expressions guarded. At the front of the room, Chief William Powell stood, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and deep lines around his mouth. He stepped forward as Richard entered. "Governor, on behalf of the entire department, I want to express our deepest..." Richard held up a hand. "Chief Powell, I appreciate the sentiment, but I didn't come here for apologies. I came to talk and, more importantly, to listen." Powell looked taken aback but nodded. "Of course, sir. The floor is yours." Richard surveyed the room, noting officers, Daniels and Taylor sitting in the back row, their eyes fixed firmly on the table in front of them. The tension in the room was thick enough to touch, a mixture of embarrassment, defensiveness, and genuine remorse. "Last night," Richard began, "I experienced something that many citizens in our state live with as a constant possibility. I was judged not by who I am or what I was doing, but by how I look and the assumptions that came with that perception." Yang moved to the center of the room, wanting to be among them rather than above them. "I could stand here and lecture you about racial profiling statistics or departmental policy violations. I could threaten funding cuts or demand firings. And believe me, there are plenty of voices in my office right now calling for exactly that." A ripple of unease went through the officers. Chief Powell's jaw tightened. "But I'm not going to do any of those things," Richard continued, "because punishment without understanding creates resentment, not change. And what I want, what our communities need, is real change." He pulled out a chair and sat down, bringing himself to eye level with the officers. "So here's what I propose. For the next hour, I want to hear from you. Not excuses or defenses, but honest thoughts. What led to last night? What pressures are you under? What training do you need? What resources are you missing? Talk to me like I'm not the governor. Talk to me like I'm just another person trying to understand." The silence that followed was profound. Officers exchanged uncertain glances, no one wanting to be the first to speak. Finally, a hand raised in the middle of the room. It belonged to a female officer, maybe mid-30s, with short brown hair and tired eyes. "Officer?" Richard checked her nameplate. "Garcia. Go ahead." She took a deep breath. "Sir, we're understaffed and overworked. Most of us are pulling double shifts at least twice a week. When you're exhausted and on edge, your training suffers. You start making snap judgments because you don't have the energy to think things through." Richard nodded. "Thank you for your honesty. That's exactly the kind of insight I need to hear." Another hand went up, then another. Slowly, the dam broke. Officers spoke about outdated equipment, about feeling caught between community expectations and department metrics, about the lack of mental health support, about the fear that came with every traffic stop. "We never know who we're approaching," one veteran officer said. "Every car door could be the last one I open." Richard listened, really listened, taking notes and asking follow-up questions. An hour stretched into 2. The initial awkwardness gave way to a surprisingly candid conversation. Finally, Richard turned his attention to the back of the room. "Officer Daniels, Officer Taylor, I haven't heard from either of you yet." The room went quiet again. Daniels stared at his hands while Taylor seemed to be studying the ceiling tiles with intense interest. "I'm not here to shame you," Richard assured them. "But I do want to understand what was going through your minds last night." Daniels cleared his throat, his voice barely audible when he finally spoke. "I messed up, sir. Plain and simple." "That's a start," Richard acknowledged. "But I messed up doesn't tell me why it happened or how we prevent it from happening again." Daniels looked up, meeting Richard's eyes for the first time. "The truth is, when I saw your car, something just clicked in my head. Nice car, out of place. Late at night, I made assumptions, and then when I saw you..." He trailed off, struggling for words. "When you saw someone who looks like me..." Richard finished for him. Daniels nodded miserably. "I've never thought of myself as, prejudiced. But last night made me realize I've got these automatic thoughts I wasn't even aware of." "That's true for all of us," Richard said, his tone gentler now. "The difference is in whether we recognize those thoughts and question them, or whether we act on them without reflection." Taylor spoke up, his voice stronger than his partner's. "They don't teach us that in the academy, sir. They teach us to trust our instincts, to act decisively. They don't teach us how to question our own snap judgments." Richard wrote that down. "That's valuable feedback, Officer Taylor. Thank you. Thank..." Chief Powell, who had been silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward. "Governor, if I may, what happens now?" It was the question everyone in the room was wondering. What consequences would follow last night's incident? What changes would Be demanded? Richard stood, tucking his notebook into his jacket pocket. Now we build something better together. I'm establishing a task force on policing reform, and I want officers from this department to be part of it, including Officers Daniels and Taylor. Surprised murmurs rippled through the room. You made a mistake, Richard said, looking directly at the two officers. A serious one, but I believe that those who have confronted their own biases firsthand can become the strongest advocates for change. He addressed the whole room again. This isn't about punishment. It's about progress. It's about making sure that every citizen of this state is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from. Chief Powell nodded slowly. We're committed to that goal, Governor. Good, Richard said. Because starting today, this department is going to become a model for others to follow. The incident that brought me here was painful, but what we build from it can be powerful. As the meeting broke up, officers approached Richard one by one. Some to shake his hand, others to share additional thoughts or concerns. The atmosphere had transformed from defensive tension to cautious hope. Outside, the press contingent had grown. News vans lined the street. Reporters clustered eagerly as Richard emerged from the station. Camera lenses focused on him, microphones, extended like reaching hands. This time, Richard didn't brush them off. This moment needed to be public. The conversation that had started in that meeting room needed to continue across the entire state. He stepped up to the impromptu press gathering, straightened his tie, and prepared to tell a story, not of humiliation and anger, but of listening and learning and the hard work of real change. The camera lights were blinding as Richard stepped up to address the gathered press. The crowd had swelled, with local residents joining the reporters, everyone eager to hear what the governor would say about his treatment the night before. Richard spotted Lily Thompson, the young woman who had recorded the incident, standing near the front, her phone still in hand. Last night, Richard began, his voice clear and steady. I was pulled over, handcuffed, and subjected to racial slurs by officers of this department. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. That's the headline many of you are waiting for, and yes, it's true. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised over notepads. But headlines rarely tell the full story. Richard continued. They don't capture the complexity of human interactions or the systems that shape them. What happened to me wasn't just about two officers making poor decisions. It was about training, resources, cultural understanding, and the pressures our law enforcement officers face every day. A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't the angry condemnation they had expected. I've just spent 2 hours listening to the officers of this department. I heard about their challenges, their frustrations, and yes, their biases, both conscious and unconscious. What I found wasn't a department of bad people, but good people working in a flawed system without adequate support. Richard stepped away from the microphones, wanting to appear less formal, more connected to the people watching. Make no mistake. What happened last night was wrong. It was hurtful. It was unjust. And it must not be repeated. But fixing this isn't as simple as firing 2 officers and moving on. That might satisfy our desire for quick justice, but it wouldn't address the root causes. He gestured toward the police station behind him. Today we're beginning a new chapter. I'm establishing a statewide task force on policing reform, and this department will be at its center. Not because they're the worst. They're not. But because they've now had to confront these issues directly and publicly. They have the most powerful motivation to become better. Tom Welker from the local paper raised his hand. Governor, are you saying there will be no consequences for the officers who handcuffed you? Richard nodded, acknowledging the question's importance. There will be consequences, Mr. Welker, but they won't be punitive in nature. Officers Daniels and Taylor will be required to undergo additional training, and they'll become part of our community outreach program. Sharing what they've learned from this experience, they'll work directly with community members from diverse backgrounds to build understanding and trust. Another reporter called out, Sir, many people are calling for their badges. Your own attorney general offered to prosecute them. Are you concerned your approach seems too lenient? Richard smiled slightly. I'm not concerned with appearing tough or lenient. I'm concerned with creating real change. Ask yourself this. What serves our communities better? 2 officers losing their jobs or 2 officers becoming champions for better policing? Which outcome actually makes life better for our citizens? He scanned the crowd, noting the mix of reactions. Some nodding in agreement, others looking skeptical. I understand the desire for punishment. When we're hurt, we want others to hurt in return. It's a natural human response. But leadership isn't about following our first instincts. It's about finding the path that brings the most good, even when that path is harder to explain. A woman near the back raised her hand. Governor, what about the racist comments? How can officers who made such remarks be trusted to protect all citizens equally? The question cut to the heart of the matter, and Richard took a moment before responding. That's the right question to ask, he acknowledged. And if I believed these officers were irredeemable, if I thought their actions came from deep-seated hatred rather than ignorance and poor training, I would be calling for their removal. But what I saw in that meeting room was shame and regret. I saw men confronting ugly truths about themselves for the first time. That's where growth begins. He stepped closer to the crowd. I'm not asking anyone to forget or excuse what happened. I'm asking for something much harder. I'm asking for engagement in a process of healing and improvement that isn't quick or simple. It's easier to fire someone than to fix a broken system. It's easier to express outrage than to do the messy work of building bridges. I'm choosing the harder path because it's the one that leads to lasting change. Behind him, the door to the police station opened. Chief Powell emerged, followed by several officers, including Daniels and Taylor. They stood uncertainly at the top of the steps, watching the press conference unfold. Richard noticed them and made a split-second decision. Chief Powell, Officers Daniels and Taylor, would you join me, please? The crowd shifted, cameras swiveling to capture the officers as they hesitantly approached. The tension was palpable as they took their places beside the governor. Officer Daniels looked like he might be sick, while Taylor stood stiffly at attention, his face a careful blank. Reform isn't something that happens to a department, Richard said. It's something that happens with them. These officers have agreed to be part of our new initiative, not because they were forced, but because they've seen firsthand why it's necessary. He turned to Daniels. Officer, would you like to say something to the people here? Daniels looked startled, clearly unprepared for this moment. He glanced at his chief, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Daniels began, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again. What I did last night was wrong. The way I spoke to Governor Chen, the assumptions I made, there's no excuse for it. He looked directly at Richard. Sir, I am truly sorry for how I treated you. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Richard nodded in acknowledgement. And to the community, Daniels continued, gaining confidence. I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better. I never saw myself as someone with prejudice, but last night showed me that I have work to do on myself. I'm asking for the chance to show that people can learn and change. Murmurs ran through the crowd, some supportive, others still skeptical. Taylor stepped forward next, his posture still rigid, but his expression more open. When you put on this uniform, you make a promise to protect and serve everyone equally. Last night we broke that promise. I can stand here and list all the reasons why. We were tired, we were stressed, we've had incidents in that area before. But none of that justifies what happened. He looked out at the gathered faces. The governor is giving us a second chance that many people wouldn't. We understand that trust isn't given back automatically. We'll have to earn it day by day, interaction by interaction. And that starts now. Richard watched their faces as they spoke, seeing the genuine remorse, the desire to make amends. This was the response he had hoped for but hadn't been certain he would get. It reinforced his belief that he was taking the right approach. Chief Powell spoke next, outlining immediate changes to department policies and training protocols. As he detailed specific reforms, body cameras for all officers, revised use of force guidelines, improved de-escalation training, Richard noticed Lily Thompson making her way through the crowd toward him. When Powell finished speaking, Lily raised her hand. Richard nodded to her. Governor Chen, she said, her voice strong despite her evident nervousness. I recorded what happened last night because I've seen too many incidents where the truth gets buried. I never expected you to take this approach. She paused. To be honest, I thought you'd come out swinging, demanding firings and investigations. Richard smiled. It would have been easier. Maybe, Lily acknowledged. But I want you to know that what you're doing makes sense to me. My brother is a police officer in another state. He's a good person who sometimes works in a broken system. We need change that includes everyone, not just punishment that divides us further. Her words hung in the air, offering a perspective that bridged the gap between community concerns and the realities of policing. Several people nodded in agreement. As the press conference wound down, Richard saw Tom Welker from the newspaper scribbling furiously in his notepad. The story that would emerge from today wouldn't be the simple tale of outrage and retribution that everyone had expected. It would be more nuanced, more challenging, and ultimately more important. Richard stepped back to the microphones one last time. What happened last night reflects problems that exist throughout our state and our nation. They won't be solved in a day or with a single decision. But today in this small town, we're taking the first steps toward something better. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. He looked out at the faces before him. Citizens, officers, reporters, all part of the community he served. The easy path would have been to turn this incident into a moment of division. Instead, we're going to make it a catalyst for connection and change. That's the harder path, but it's the one that leads forward. And I invite all of you to walk it with us. As he stepped away from the microphones, Officer Daniels approached him quietly. Governor, I need to ask, why did you do this? You could have ended our careers. You had every right to. Richard considered the question carefully. Officer Daniels, throughout my life I've experienced moments like last night, being judged, dismissed, or feared because of how I look. Each time I had a choice, to become bitter or to become better. I've always tried to choose the latter. He looked the officer in the eye. The question isn't why I'm giving you a second chance, the question is what you're going to do with it. Daniels nodded slowly, the weight of that responsibility visible on his face. I won't let you down, sir. It's not about me, Richard corrected. Gently. It's about the community you serve. Don't let them down. As Richard walked back to his waiting car, people reached out to shake his hand or offer words of support. The mood had shifted from tense expectation to cautious hope. There was still skepticism, still anger, but also something new, a sense that perhaps this time, something meaningful might change. David opened the car door for him, a mixture of pride and concern on his face. That was quite a statement, sir, not the one most people were expecting. Richard slid into the back seat, feeling the weight of the past 24 hours in every muscle. Sometimes leadership means surprising people, David. Even yourself. As the car pulled away, Richard caught a glimpse of Officers Daniels and Taylor, still standing on the steps of the station, watching him go. Their journey was just beginning, as was the larger journey toward reform. It wouldn't be easy or perfect, but it was necessary, and sometimes that was enough. 6 months had passed since that night on the roadside. The summer heat had given way to autumn crispness, trees along the highway painted in fiery oranges and deep reds. Richard Chen's car wound through the same roads that had brought him to this small town half a year ago, but this time with an official escort and a purpose that went beyond a simple community meeting. Nervous, sir? David asked from the driver's seat, glancing in the rearview mirror. Richard looked up from the folder of statistics he'd been reviewing. Not nervous, hopeful, but cautious. Real change takes more than 6 months. Still, what you've started here, it's making waves across the state. Richard nodded, turning to look out the window as they passed the exact spot where he'd been pulled over. Someone had placed a small wooden sign there that read simply, Day 1. Locals called it the marker of when things began to change. The town looked different today. Banners hung across Main Street announcing the opening of the new Community Police Partnership Center. People lined the sidewalks, some holding small flags, others just watching curiously as the governor's motorcade passed. This wasn't a wealthy community. The closed factory still stood as a monument to harder times, but there was a palpable energy that hadn't been there before. They pulled up in front of the renovated building that would house the new center. Once an abandoned department store, it had been transformed with fresh paint, new windows, and a sign that featured both the police department badge and a community handshake logo side by side. Chief Powell waited at the entrance, along with Mayor Grayson and a mix of officers and community members. Among them, Richard spotted Officers Daniels and Taylor, standing a bit straighter in their uniforms than they had 6 months ago. "Governor Chen," Powell greeted him, extending his hand. "Welcome back to Pine Ridge." "Thank you, Chief," Richard replied, shaking his hand firmly. "It's good to see the progress." "We've come a long way," Powell acknowledged, "though we still have further to go." Mayor Grayson stepped forward, a small woman with a commanding presence. "Governor, on behalf of our town, I want to thank you for turning what could have been a divisive incident into something constructive. Many politicians would have used what happened to score points. You chose to build bridges instead." Richard smiled. "The credit belongs to this community, Mayor Grayson. My role was small compared to the work that's been done here." They walked inside, where a ribbon stretched across the central hall. The space had been divided into several areas: a meeting room with circular tables, a training center with modern equipment, a community resources section, and a wall covered with photographs showing joint police community activities from the past 6 months. Richard paused to study the photos. There was Officer Daniels coaching a youth basketball team, Officer Taylor sitting with elderly residents at the senior center. The entire department participating in cultural sensitivity training, led by community leaders from various backgrounds. Chief Powell breaking ground on the renovation with Lily Thompson, who now served as the community liaison for the department. "This is remarkable," Richard said, genuinely impressed. "It hasn't all been smooth sailing," Powell admitted, his voice low enough that only Richard could hear. "We've had setbacks. Some officers resigned rather than embrace the changes. A few community members remain skeptical, but the momentum is in the right direction." A crowd had gathered in the main hall for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Richard recognized many faces: Tom Welker from the newspaper, residents from the community meeting he'd attended 6 months ago, officers who had been in that tense meeting at the police station. They were mingling now, talking and laughing, together in a way that would have seemed impossible that night on the roadside. Officer Daniels approached, looking nervous but determined. "Governor Chen, do you have a moment?" "Of course, Officer Daniels." They stepped aside, finding a quiet corner near a display of community artwork. "I wanted to thank you personally," Daniels said, his voice steadier than it had been during that press conference 6 months ago. "Not just for saving my job, but for," he searched for the words, "for seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself." Richard nodded. "How has the process been for you?" Daniels gave a small, rueful laugh. "Hard. Really hard. The training made me confront things about myself I didn't want to admit. Working with the community, hearing their stories, understanding their fears when they see a uniform." He shook his head. "It changed me. For the better, I hope." "Definitely." Daniels met his eyes directly now, something he had struggled to do months ago. "I'm a better officer and a better person. My wife says I'm more present, more thoughtful. I listen more, judge less." Before Richard could respond, Mayor Grayson called everyone to attention for the ceremony. He made his way to the front where a podium had been set up beside the ribbon. "Before we begin," the mayor announced, "Officer Taylor has asked to say a few words." Taylor stepped forward, looking different than Richard remembered. The rigid posture remained. Old military habits died hard, but his face was more open, his eyes more engaged with the people around him. "6 months ago," Taylor began, "I was part of a terrible mistake. The governor came to our town, and instead of being welcomed, he was handcuffed and insulted." He paused, his eyes finding Richard in the crowd. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened that night and why. The easy explanation would be that we were tired or that we didn't recognize him. But the harder truth is that we saw someone who looked different from most people in our town, and we made assumptions that were wrong and hurtful. The room was completely silent, everyone listening intently. Since then, I've learned that being a good police officer isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about understanding the community you serve. All of the community, not just the parts that look like you or think like you. Taylor gestured to the center around them. This place represents a new beginning, not just for our department, but for our town. And it wouldn't exist if Governor Chen had chosen revenge instead of reconciliation. A wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Richard nodded in acknowledgement, touched by the officer's words. Mayor Grayson stepped back to the microphone. And now, I'd like to invite Governor Chen to say a few words before we cut the ribbon. Richard took the podium, looking out at the gathered faces, a true cross-section of the community in all its diversity. When I drove through Pine Ridge 6 months ago, I was just passing through, he began. I never expected that a routine traffic stop would change not only my life, but the direction of policing in our state. What happened that night was painful, but what has happened since has been inspiring. He gestured to the center around them. This facility isn't just a building. It's a statement of values and a commitment to continuous improvement. It says that police and community aren't separate entities, but partners in creating safety and justice for everyone. Richard spotted Lily Thompson in the crowd, her phone in hand, not recording this time but taking photos to document the day. The task force we created has now implemented reforms in 15 departments across our state. Body cameras, improved. Training, community oversight boards, these are making a difference. But the most important change isn't in policies or procedures. It's in relationships. It's in officers who know the communities they serve, and communities that trust the officers who protect them. He paused, letting his gaze move across the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. 6 months ago, I was handcuffed, on the side of the road not far from here. I felt humiliated, angry, and alone. Today, I look around this room and see connection, commitment, and hope. That transformation is what leadership is all about. Not clinging to grievances, but creating opportunities for growth and understanding. Richard stepped away from the podium and moved to the ribbon. Mayor Grayson handed him a large pair of ceremonial scissors. The work isn't finished, he continued, holding the scissors poised. This is just one milestone on a longer journey. There will be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, possibly even setbacks. But today we celebrate how far we've come and recommit ourselves to the path forward. With a clean snip, he cut the ribbon. Applause filled the room as confetti rained down from hidden dispensers in the ceiling. As the formal ceremony transitioned into a community open house, Richard found himself drawn into conversations with residents and officers alike. People shared their stories, both good and bad experiences with law enforcement, hopes for the future, suggestions for further improvements. He listened carefully to each one, recognizing that this ongoing dialogue was the true heart of the initiative. Later, as the event was winding down, Richard stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The autumn sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town square. Chief Powell joined him, offering a cup of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts, Governor?" Powell asked. Richard accepted the coffee gratefully. "I was just thinking about how differently this all could have gone. One decision point, one moment of choosing anger over understanding, and none of this would exist." Powell nodded slowly. "When Sergeant Miller called me that night, telling me you were in handcuffs on the side of the road, I thought my department was finished. I thought Daniels and Taylor were finished. I never imagined we'd end up here." "Life rarely follows the path we expect," Richard mused. "Sometimes it takes a wrong turn to find the right destination." They stood in companionable silence, watching as people streamed in and out of the center, police officers and community members side by side, no longer divided by uniform or background, or history, but united in their commitment to a better future. Inside, Officer Daniels was showing a group of teenagers the new virtual reality training system that helped officers practice de-escalation techniques. Officer Taylor sat with a group of elderly residents taking notes on their safety concerns. Lily Thompson was leading a tour for new volunteers interested in the community liaison program. This wasn't the end of the story, Richard knew. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, not only for Pine Ridge but for communities across the state. The incident that had brought him to his knees in handcuffs had ultimately lifted everyone to a higher place of understanding. As the last light of day faded, Richard pulled his coat tighter against the autumn chill and smiled. Sometimes the most powerful leadership happened not from behind a podium or desk, but from moments of vulnerability and choices made in the aftermath of pain. What had started as one of the worst nights of his life had become a catalyst for some of his most meaningful work, and that perhaps was the greatest lesson of all.